Hello, everybody. Welcome to Satsang and the question and answer tonight. I'm going to do a little bit of, I think we'll do a little bit different tonight. I'm going to start off like I normally do and talk to everybody. And then at one point in time, we have some options here. One of them is that I can bring people up and they can actually talk with me if they want to do a question. And or you can see that you can put a question in the little box on the side where everybody can watch that as well. So I'll probably just bring somebody up and chat with them for a minute just so everybody can see what that looks like. This is a new technology to me, and so I'm still playing with it. If we like Zoom better, we might switch over to that. This seems to be really ready to go. You get to click it and it records it, and everybody can kind of be in the background if they like that. And a lot of times it's satsang, that's what people like. So anyway, tonight I wanted to talk a little bit as we started in with everything going on in our world today. I mean, we're in the middle of a global pandemic and we have demonstrations in the street. The one thing I really notice on everyone's mind is that there is a real motivation to ask yourself, what should I be involved in? And in fact, it's beyond that. It's almost the pull to the outside. And so there's a pointer I use a lot, which is the illusion of destination. And what that means is if you think about your life, the way your life goes on every single day, in your mind you say, well, this is the destination that I want to get to. And so we're doing that in our world today. If you think about it, we're saying, oh, I would like to have peace in the streets, or Black Lives Matter, or I'd like to not have a coronavirus, or you should, the goal is to have this sickness live in this particular way. But if you think about your life itself, there's never a time when there isn't some action going on. That's the nature of life. So even when you get to your destination, we imagine that that destination is somewhere fixed and that it's a flat, stable platform. That's, I think, how we dream it up in our minds. And yet when we get there, it's the same motion that is occurring when you get there that actually was occurring all the way along. And so what's that about? Like, why is it that the human mind does that? And so I wanted to just kind of start with an idea that at the intuitive level, we actually all know that there is a place of permanent peace and stability. That's intuitively understood. And in fact, I think that's the part that speaks to us when we start our spiritual journey. We identify as though we are an actor in the drama. And as that actor, we're always in motion. And so our mind in its own way says, wait a minute, I want to find that place of pure stability. That's great. That's a nice motivation. But of course, guess where it looks? Well, it looks to the outside. So the illusion of destination is the idea that you could find somewhere that was stable, a permanent place of peace, and that it would exist on the outside. Because you see, consciousness by its very nature is change itself. So how could there be a place of permanent peace or permanent platform or stability on the outside? We know that the very planet that we live on is hurtling through space at some speed that I don't know. So some physicist would probably be able to tell us that. But the reality is change and motion and the activity of life is actually what consciousness is. So where is this particular platform of not change, of everything that there is? And it's pretty easy to find. You can actually, I'll talk a little bit about it, but it's not hard to find. It's actually inside you. But it brings to mind an old story. And like most of my stories, I have lifted this one from someone else. Um, and that person would be Osho. Osho used to talk about this old uh, wise man. He was kind of a fool in a certain way. His name was Mullah Nasruddin. And Mullah Nasruddin was this old Islamic wisdom man who lived in the kind of era when you would go across the desert on your camel and you would stop and you would have these big tent cities would emerge, and that would be the market to where you would go. And he was one of those guys. And so Mullah was very beloved. He was a very beloved man. And so one day he was in the market, and he had set his stall up, and his friends came upon him, and they said, and they noticed he was down on his hands and knees. And they said, Mullah, what's going on here? Why are you down on your hands and knees? And he says, you know what? I'm looking for my lost key. I can't find my key. I've lost it. And so his friends, being the kind of people that they were, immediately, they got down on their hands and knees and they started to help him find his keys. Great. Well, after about 5 or 10 minutes of this, and they're having no luck, of course, one of his closest friends, he says, you know, Mullah, he said, are you sure that this is where you lost your key? And Mullah stopped and he said, well, no, I'm actually quite sure this is not where I lost my key. I know this isn't where I lost my key. And they said, well, Mullah, why in the world are we all down here on our hands and knees and we're looking for this key, and you actually know this is not where you lost the key? He says, he says, I wanted to start to search where the light was best. Well, that's a little like our ego. Our ego knows that there is such a thing as stability. And so what it does is it goes to the outside because that's the only place that it knows. And it goes and it searches where the light is best. Of course, it's not at all where you can find what it is that it's searching for. And so if you watch the events of the world around us, you're going to see an exercise in folks looking for something that obviously cannot be found, because the minute that someone thinks that they've arrived at the place that they're supposed to arrive, it's a little like 31 flavors. There's the next thing in line that now needs to be dealt with that is full of tension and conflict and all of the rest. And so looking where the light is best is actually the illusion of destination. And so that's the first piece I wanted to start with. It's always kind of a fun one to think about. So think about, well, where is the stability in us? I said I would talk about that. If you think about your entire life, you will notice that one thing is absolutely always the same. And that is, you can go back to your youngest life. You can be 2 or 3 years old, as far back as you can remember. And the one thing that is, no matter whether the activity was at a high point or a low point, you can go back and you can remember that you viewed that particular, or perceived, you viewed, heard, whatever it was. Your memory will include, almost like a movie, the happening of that event. So what's the permanent piece in each of us? Well, the permanent piece is that watching, is that seeing, is that vision. Now, we've even taken that and bastardized it, if you will, because when I ask you about going through your life, you're going to explain to me how you walked through your life as though the stable part was your life and you were the part that was moving through it. It's a lot like talking about the sun rising and the sun setting. That's, if you're standing here, the sun rises and sets, but actually the sun stays where it is. So we do that in order to talk about how we are and how we move through life. But if you'll stop for a second and just think, The reality is that life moves through you. What is the one thing that is always present and always the same? It's the part of you that looks out, it's consciousness. And in consciousness, which is always the stable thing and peace of what's going on, life moves through consciousness. And how do we describe it? Well, it gets egoized, because the ego believes that it is a character within the drama, and that it is actually in some way walking through that drama. And we explain that to each other so often that there is really no other way to conceive that. We don't speak of life as though it's moving through us. And in fact, when a mystic does, and you can go listen to lots of them, you're going to see an incredible look of consternation on someone's face when someone starts to speak as though life is moving through them, and and all they are is the permanent perceiver of that movement. And so these little things, if you'll notice them, you will start to notice where to look. So in today's world, the largest questions that are coming to most all of us are what should I do? How should I be active in all of what I see in front of me? What do I do about what I see possibly as equality in our world when it's so obvious that there isn't? What should I do about a global pandemic when I see in the United States 130,000 people have died of this particular disease, and they're projecting by October we'll be at 200,000. So what happens is that there begins to become this kernel of thought, and the kernel of thought says, what should I do? And actually, the place to find that answer is, rather than looking out and processing within the ego mind complex the answer is already available in our consciousness. And the other thing to watch is, it may not be that you will be an actor in the drama. For what happens in the spiritual search is that there is a point where wisdom is simply magnetized and broadcast. And a lot of times the call for someone who can sort out that viewing is not going to be active on one side or the other. That's the activity of an ego in duality. Whereas in the world of wisdom, it's the ability to access the clarity that comes with wisdom in order to know what possibly one would want to do. So that's just a little bit of the lay of the land. So notice what I'm doing here. What happens is that all of us believe, or have been led to believe, and certainly taught to believe, that we are what I call the autonomous author of our own journey. And what happens in all spiritual paths lead to one thing, and that is the understanding that actually consciousness lives each of us into being, and that we are not autonomous in any way. Consciousness has written a storybook, and we are all characters. Now, being the kind of uppity characters that we are, we have decided to take onto ourselves the idea that the author who wrote us into the story didn't actually design what it was that we were going to do. And so that's now on us. And so what we are rebellious characters in a drama. And what happens is we begin to experience misery. And that misery comes from the fact that we are imagining that we should be doing something other than what is happening, because the author who wrote us in is having us do exactly what it is we need to do. And in our minds, we can imagine something different. And of course, if you remember, Buddha used to always define misery as the difference between what is and what it is that one wants to do that's different from what is. That was the source of all misery. Now, physical suffering and things like that, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the misery of the mind. And if you look at your life, you're going to find out that most of your misery for most folks over the span of their life is the kind that lives in their mind. Occasionally, yes, there is suffering, and yes, there is pleasure. Those things happen to the body, mind, and that's really a thing that happens, and there it is. But the misery that one feels is always related to what it is that one thinks ought to be happening and what is that is actually happening. And that's actually what I'm pointing to. So what will happen in what we all do is to take a look at how we assume things are happening, which a lot of times includes how we think we are authoring and controlling the world. Now, if you look at your life, I'm sure you all recognize that most of what happens in your life isn't what you thought was going to happen. So we kind of have that as an established place. But the pointers are to point to a possibility that life is happening differently than you are holding and understand that life is happening. And it's in that penetration that the possibility that you will see yourself as the consciousness that you are will arise and will actually be where you stand. And a lot of you have had experiences along the way. Ramesh used to call those free samples, which is just the moment where it is completely seen that your ego is being lived into the moment and that consciousness itself is holding that particular arising. So everything that I do, when you see me go back and point out that, gee, this is how we all believe it works, this is what we all tell ourselves is going on, but actually that's what's going on. And in fact, here is kind of a way to look at it from your own very experience to see that there's a high likelihood that how we think is happening, it's not. And that's the blindness of the ego. That's the ego that the autonomous doer, whatever term you want to use, that has us believe that something is happening when it's not. Now, the ego is really great and the mind's really wonderful because it goes around and collects all the information to prove that its case is right, and it ignores all the information that isn't. Luckily, there's a lot of that information that points to how it might be that we're not actually believing that it is. So that's the stuff that makes up pointers. I remember one time at a satsang that Ramesh gave, that this fellow came in and he was very, very sure that he was authoring his own movement through life. And I remember Ramesh looked at him and he said, well, is this really what you thought you'd be doing right now? He says, you had this fabulous career, you had traveling all over the world, and you got so miserable and depressed that you quit all of that. And now you're sitting in the middle of a hovel in Mumbai, India at 45 years old. I'm thinking that possibly that wasn't what it is that you were thinking you were authoring. And the man said, you're absolutely right. And he said, well, given all of that evidence and given where you've arrived, how is it that you continue to think that you're the one that's in charge of all of this? So I think most people can actually just do that if you want to. You can say, is what is happening and where I am what I thought or what I designed for me to have happen? Because I've got to believe, certainly me, like most of you, I wanted to be a philosophy professor, and you can kind of see how that turned out. So you can probably pick. I also thought I would be a world famous athlete. Unfortunately, I don't happen to have any of those characteristics. But I would have liked to have been a world famous athlete and a philosophy professor. That would have been a really cool outcome for, young guy that was looking at the world and thinking that maybe he was the one that was going to make it happen. But unfortunately, the way that things were, none of those things were possible. So I became a CPA instead. What the heck? And I am sure that if you checked in with me in the 60s when all of our world is having this wonderful, amazing moment, and you'd have said, hey, young man, you're 15 years old. What do you think about being a CPA for 40 years? I'd have said, yeah, you know what? I'm thinking that maybe that's not where I want to go. So think about that and take a look at that. So anyway, I don't know. I don't see any questions yet, but we'll if you have one, put it up, and I'll veer into that question. I'm going to invite. It looks like James is on, and I'm going to pop on here and see if I can get James to come up, and we're just going to talk so you guys can see what that looks like. So if you want to ask a question and you really want to come up here, so let's see if we can get James to come up here with me for a second. Yeah, let's see. I invited him. Let's see. Can you check on that, James, and come in, or did I? Here we go. Here he comes. It says he's accepted and he's connecting. So I'm hoping that he comes onto my screen here. This wonderful software of ours, and you guys can get an actual view. Well, I don't know. He doesn't seem to be coming on. So technology is deserting us. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll do that. And let's give. How about Justine? Let's see if Justine will come on for me. Let's see. This is a good question. Thanks, Greg. So how would we, I'm assuming that's a we, that's right there, move towards being less of somebody and more of nobody, as Ram Dass says? All right, here we go. Looks to me like I've got Justine on the screen. Oh, I forgot. Your camera doesn't work, does it, Justine?
Not so much.
Is your microphone?
Not so much. It's been rainforested.
Yeah, Justine bought so here's a funny story. This is my wife, Justine, and I would introduce you to her if you could see her. But she bought a brand new, she brought a brand new computer from, from Best Buy, and brought it to Hawaii. And this is what it looks like when you bring a brand new computer with a beautiful camera on it to Hawaii. It clouds up, and this is the result. But this is good enough if somebody wants. Yeah. So if you're in your spiritual search and it's working, this is what you look like. So anyway, so this is Justine, and thank you for coming up. So if you want to jump up with a question, feel free to do that. And I will. I'll excuse you at this point, Justine. I think we got the idea, but feel free if you want to jump up and have a chat with me to do that. Thanks. It is kind of funny that it happened this way, and I couldn't even get I couldn't even get James up here. So the way that we move forward towards being less of somebody and more of nobody, as Ram Dass would say it. Nisargadatta used to make the comment that in love he was everything, and in meditation he was nothing. And so Ram Dass had the tendency to come from the meditative, the nothing side. And so that it's the same question. When somebody says, how can you and I be the same thing? How can I be everything like you're everything? Or how can I be nothing like everyone else is nothing? It's the same thing, which means that there's a recognition that what we are is consciousness itself. And so no matter which path you take, all of the paths arrive at the same place. And I probably have said this before. In the kind of ancient world, there are three main paths. There is the path of what we call bhakti, which is a path of love. And that's when one entity loves another entity, and that happens to such an intensity that the boundaries disappear. And so there you are. You are now, there is no difference between you and anything else. And that's the movement towards nothing. Your ego, your story has to dissolve in order for that to happen. And that can come through love. There's another way to do it, which is through service or seva. And that's when you're serving someone else to such a degree that you can't at some point tell the difference between you and that other person. You're simply serving yourself. So that same boundary disappears. And the way that we do it here is through what we call Advaita, or it's the non-dual approach, which I enjoy because it's the latest fancy word, non-duality, which kind of tells me that people are afraid to use the word enlightenment because it comes from India. But nonetheless, it's enlightenment, which is the same in the other cases. But what we do is that we begin to install a living understanding of how life is. And that living understanding actually is an understanding of who we are as consciousness, not who we are as an ego. So as we begin to accept the fact that we are not an autonomous doer, and we start to experience that living understanding where we can actually tangibly feel that we are consciousness, and that consciousness is simply living through us. All we are is a conduit. So it's as though in the beginning, I sit here and Greg sits here. Greg asks the question. Justine sits here. James, who I couldn't get on camera, he can't seem to get it to happen. That's fine. But each of us look out, and there's a belief that we've inherited that says, oh, Alan is looking out, Justine is looking out, Greg is looking out. We recognize that actually what's happening is the ego is that story that thinks it's looking out, and actually all of us are simply being perceptive apparatus for consciousness. The only thing that's looking out is consciousness itself. And that begins to become our reality. So that's how you begin to move that way. Now, I tell a little story. I'm trying to think who I stole. I think this is a Ramesh story. So in one of the ancient times, there was this, and James heard it yesterday. James took me to my little birthday lunch down at the beach yesterday. So I told him this story. So in the ancient times, there was, as you know, kings and queens, and they would have their wise men and their number one counselor and all of that. And so one day they were going to throw in this ancient kingdom a big party. And of course, as you know, in a party like that, the king comes in last. So everybody was assembled in the great hall, and everybody was in their seat, and except for the king's throne, which was sitting empty. And this little fellow came walking into the hall. Nobody had ever seen him before. He looked like a beggar from the street. Proceeded to kind of look at the hall, and he wandered up and he sat on the king's throne. Well, this created some consternation. And so, of course, the number one counselor to the king, since the king wasn't there, was going to be the fellow that handled this situation. And he kind of figured, hey, I'll get this guy ushered out of here. And he went up to him and he says, look, I can see you sat in the seat. And he says, that's the king's throne. And he says, I know everybody in this whole kingdom. He says, I know everybody from the knaves and through the knights and the dukes and the barons. And he says, so I know you're not one of the knaves. And he says, oh, no. He says, of course I'm not a knave. He says, the little fellow responded. And he said, I'm more than that. And he said, well, okay. He says, well, I know you're not one of the knights or the earls. And he said, well, of course I'm not one of the knights or the earls. I'm more than that. And finally he said, clearly you're not one of the counselors I'd be speaking to you every day. And I'm the number one counselor in all of this. He said, so you can't be one of those. And he says, yeah, of course. He says, I'm not one of those. He says, I'm more than that. And he says, well, all that's left is the king, and you're sitting in his seat. And he says, yeah. He says, the king. He says, you know what? I'm more than that. And finally, the counselor completely at wit's end, looked at him and he said, "Don't you realize that nothing is more than the king?" And he says, "And you're absolutely right." He says, "I am that nothing." So there you go, Greg. There's a story of how you become more of that nobody or nothing, as Ram Dass says. Because one can see that Alan, all of the counselors, the earls, the knaves, and all of those people are just a story, and that we believe that that story is us. And the way to become more of nothing is to recognize that that story identity is what we identify with. In other words, we have onboarded the belief that the story of Alan is who Alan is, and Alan then acts as if that was the case. And we do that for a lifetime. And then there comes a moment where intuitively we know something's wrong. When that happens to me, or happened to me, I got on a plane and went to India and gave up a burgeoning merger acquisition practice, and off I went. The misery was such that it drove me to do that. So that sense that there's something wrong, that intuitive communication is what moves one. And what begins to happen is you go, oh, the life I've always lived isn't who I am. That's my story identity. Who I am is consciousness itself living that story identity. The author. I am the author. Now, I'm not the author in an individual sense. There's only one author, and I and you and everyone is that author's looking through these eyes and seeing all that happens. And so it takes usually a long time to start to actually tangibly experience that. These pointers and this talking is all to lead one to hopefully to a place where the experience, the perception of the moment, Nisargadatta called it apperception, which is perceiving without a perceiver. In other words, no individual perceiving, no individual perceiver, but the perceiving is happening by consciousness itself. And so that's the living understanding that leads to awakening, self-realization, non-duality. Pick one. It's any of those. So, so the thing I might say, Greg, also, it's the I want to shed the roles and just be myself. Remember, that becomes a little of a mistake if you think you are the one to do that. You see, that's a repetition of what we already have, and then you just become the best spiritual person rather than the best business person or the best athlete or the best whatever. Osho used to say, watch out for the humble ones, because the best humble guy is as proud as the best of anything else. So anything that we try to be by our own volition. So how does it work? Well, how it works is that as these pointers and these understandings migrate and root, right? Awareness itself creates that change. And so if you think about how life actually happens, most of the time, you don't do much of anything else. It's just simply the awareness of the case somehow descends. And when that happens, the whole way that you look at the world changes. Then, of course, the ego runs in and says, wait, whoop, time out. I did that. That was me. Pick me. So just watch that. We're so used to that story that no matter what happens to us, we claim it and story it in as though we made it happen. But if you actually go back and look, you're going to find out that most of everything that happened in your life wasn't really a function of you making it happen. What happened is you saw and understood. There was an understanding that occurred, and that awareness just shifted how it was that life was seen. And so it actually is happening within you. It's just being claimed by your ego as though that's how it happened. So we run around trying to do that all the time. And that's what I started off with. Remember I said you go out and you go, what should I do out there? Rather than looking inside and saying, oh, if the understanding simply migrates into the place that it needs to be, then I will be doing authentically the perfect thing, just exactly what I'm designed for. So All right. So somebody asked me, hey, how does one maintain our conscious awareness in an ego-driven world of corporate business? One of my favorite questions, by the way. So when I went to India, I was at the kind of the pinnacle of the business world. I'm not even sure I've ever gone back to where I was when I went. I think I might have been more important at age 35 than I've ever been since, in terms of how people saw me in the corporate world. So there you go. But I went there, and when I came back, I was absolutely dedicated to never being in the business world again, because I had looked out there and I said, oh, look at that business world. That's bad. Bad. That's the dark side. Darth Vader lives over there. Yeah, Alan's one of the good guys, so I'll have to find something else to do. And what happened was that I kept getting deposited back into the corporate world. No matter what I did or what I tried to do, the corporate world was where the action was. That's where I was drawn. That's where I could do things. That's where the activity of the Alan story seemed to want to happen. Well, in fact, I use the Jonah and the whale story a lot. I always say, I tell people when they're I talk to corporate people and they're finding that they can't get out of the corporate thing, and I say, well, you can do it the way I did, which is resist like hell. And like Jonah and the whale is going to swallow you, and he's going to burp you up, gastric juices and all, onto the corporate beach. Or you can, because eventually what I did was I accepted the fact that that's where the story was going to happen, and that's where the belonging was going to happen. So I said, if you can do that, you can just get yourself a nice Jeep and a picnic basket and drive down the little road to the same place and, enjoy it that way. So what I'm saying is that to accept yourself as, I call it a corporate animal. So for some reason, don't know why, the kind of mind, the kind of activity, the kind of engagement made me a perfect person to be in the corporate world. And when I was there, I really enjoyed it. Now, I enjoyed it in a different way, I think, than a lot of other people, because I was really interested in what was nourishing the humans within that environment and how I could take that environment and make it a platform for the awakening that had occurred while I was moving in my own path. So I'm sure most of the corporate executives aren't probably looking at it that way. But I was able to see where the ties could happen. There is no shame in coming up with a brilliant idea, moving it out into the market, having it do what it's supposed to do. And when done, with an incredible human maturity, it actually serves everybody. I always say the more authentic a story, the more authentic a story is, the more it seeks to serve. So the corporate story, at its deepest authenticity, is a story of service. So why not? But it took a while for me to get there, as I told you. So in a certain way, there's not a necessity to maintain a conscious awareness, because if in your authentically rooted story you are serving others, that's what consciousness actually seems to put us in motion to do. The stories that it writes at the deepest level are always stories of service, ultimately. Now, you may have gotten there through what I said by seeing that the concepts don't match, because if you're a mind person, and most of us in the West are, that's the tool. But at the bottom of that, we end up in service. We are all in love. We are all love with one with another. And so that, and in fact, we aren't even, there isn't a one or another, there's simply love. But that story can can be lived out on the corporate platform. You certainly are sailing into a headwind. I know that Miles is on this call. Miles is a long-time leadership consultant. And so when you talk to Miles, he's going to explain his story to you as someone who loved the corporate world, contributed to the corporate world from a consciousness standpoint, but recognized in that contribution that there was a headwind. And you can imagine that when I waltzed into a room, I had written a book called Awakened Leadership, and all they really wanted was the leadership part. The awakened part they weren't so interested in. And so that headwind does live there. But think about it for a minute. Where in our world, when you move into service, do you not run into a headwind? That headwind seems to live everywhere. So it wasn't really probably a special thing that on the corporate platform, I was running into that, and a lot of us were, that had actually located ourselves to do exactly that. So recognize that that there's no conscious awareness needed when the story is authentically rooted, because it will naturally seek to serve. And how can a mistake be made when that's the case? So a lot of people talk about how the individuals need themselves to become more conscious. I don't like to use that word. What I like to do is say there is an authentic story. I call it the original myth story. You were designed in a certain way, and when we flip the switch, that's the way that you will act. Then you were slathered with woulds, coulds, and shoulds, and recruited into the service of being something that you really was never really in that original story. And then at some point in time, the intuition says, this isn't who I am. Who am I? And bang, back to that original myth story you go. Now, that still is, even in its purest authentic state, that is the story identity. And there's one step more to recognize that your consciousness itself, but that's okay. People used to ask me, they say, Alan, if you know that getting somebody to the original myth story, because we taught this in the corporate world, original myth story, and working with people to tangibly get there, we did that. And they would say, but you're depositing them one step too short. And I would say, I'd rather be one step away than however many we were to start with. So the deliveries in the corporate world were to get people to that authentic place. Those that wanted to then step that next step beyond and start to recognize that the one final step was still available, we were available for that. So that's always been the way that we've approached it. So from a consciousness standpoint, conscious awareness isn't needed. Simply living the most authentic version of who you are, as that rooting happens, then the perfect service happens, and then the awakening sits right behind that. And that's actually the way that you play that. So, all right, I think James has a question here for me. Let's see what this one. When does story begin to be a conscious expression of who we are without our ego? The reality is, this is kind of an interesting question, because even with your ego chattering at you and being everything that you aren't, in terms of not being the highest possible conscious expression, that still is the road to becoming that conscious expression. That's just simply the path. And so when we make blithely that comment that everything is perfect exactly how it is now, which is true. What makes it not perfect is the ego chattering at you, because it is altering your experience of what it is you're actually doing. But all of those activities are the path to that conscious expression. And here's the main difference. I'll give you a really good pointer. When you come from the outside and say, I'm looking to the inside, then you are triangulating or strategizing to try to get the inside to conform to what it is that you think you see from the outside. It has a certain feel. That's the part I'm after. I think I've explained it well, but it has a certain feel. And if you're around people that process a lot and they're constantly processing and they're constantly examining, those folks, they'll tell you, I'm not so grounded. And the reason is because when you're living at this top place and looking to the inside, you're never anywhere near the bottom. You're always up here trying to find the bottom by looking into the bottom. And what you'll find is that it doesn't really happen that way. The perfect conscious expression of who you are is when you feel it move from the inside out. When it moves from the inside out, from the, I always say the basement or the bottom. Now that's just probably how the experience in this mind body holds it, which is it comes from the bottom and moves out. So that expression, I would say, is the perfect expression, and that's just a pointer, because within you lives those two things. And when you're moving from one to the other, you'll experience both of those. You'll have some of this and some of that, some of this and some of that. And I call that toggling, and be grateful for that, because that tells you that you're moving in the right direction. But the conscious expression of who you are without the ego is the sense of simply being lived, right? Now, liberation is because there's this sense of amazing liberation when that locates, or when that roots itself into being. And what it is actually the sense of knowing that it's perfect and authentically perfect when you are lived by consciousness. And this sense of freedom emerges, and then everybody says, oh, that means you are incredibly free. And actually, it's the exact opposite. You're less free. Oh, remember, that freedom only lives in your mind. It didn't really live in you, but it lived in your mind, right? Now, your mind simply moves over to the navigator seat and no longer believes that it's driving the car, because it sees that consciousness is doing that. And so that's that felt experience, if you will, of conscious expression when you're without ego. Now, a lot of us have those. They have those moments that we call, as I said, Ramesh used to call those free samples. Let me tell you a personal story. So when I went to India, now remember, I was a corporate guy, and I was fresh right off the boat. So I'm sure when these people saw me, I mean, I walked into a world with thousands of people, and they're all wearing maroon robes and talking about UFOs. So not the natural experience for a merger acquisition guy from Newport Beach, California. I want you to know there was a real kind of moment where I had to gulp hard and go, what? But I walked in my first day to talk to the fellow who was going to help me figure out what to do in the ashram, what groups to take, meditations, all of that kind of stuff, you know. And as he talked to me, he said, well, Alan, how do you think you're going to have this happen? And I said, oh, I got it covered. Let me tell you how I'm going to happen. What we're going to do is you're going to tell me all the things that you need to do, and I'm going to write those down, one to whatever that number is, and I'm going to knock those suckers out one at a time. When I'm done, I'm enlightened. So what he did is he put me in a 21-day primal group in silence, because he probably figured, man, whatever, you can't do anything wrong with this guy, because if he thinks enlightenment is a to-do list that you knock out, and when you're done, you're enlightened. I can put him in any group I want. So 21 days in silence for this yakka, this guy that talks all the time, is going to be perfect. So, but you know, that stayed with me. So even a year or two later, I would go in and I would listen to Osho, and as he would speak, and I was reading Papaji and Ramana Maharshi, and all of this was coming in. But I had decided that if I could construct in my mind the perfect theory of everything, I called it, that would open the door. Now, I wasn't that far off. My perfect theory of everything, though, included all of the assumptions that with our pointers we're trying to unravel. I hadn't gotten to that particular place yet, but I was trying to positively build this theory of everything. And so every night, I literally would go home sit in my room and spend 2 or 3 hours and take everything I had learned, completely unravel my theory, put the new things into my theory, and the next day I had a new theory of everything. Really cool. And I remember that I could listen to Osho, I could listen to Nisargadatta, I could listen to, Ramana, I could listen to whoever it was, Ram Dass, you pick. And I could see the differences in each of those people. And for the life of me, it was really difficult to get those to kind of mesh, because they should, right? If you have a theory of everything, then all of the masters who are speaking, what they're saying should meet somewhere. It should be the same thing. And it just couldn't be done. So remember, I was looking at it from the mind from the outside. I was trying to pinpoint it on the inside, and I was trying to make it actually match from that particular point. And I'm here to tell you that cannot be done. So there came a point where I began to be led into this other way of maybe looking at things. And that might have been just me being seasoned and having a little bit of experience. I don't know that it was linear in any way. I think everyone's journey, we try to make it linear, and I doubt it is. But the reality was that there came a moment where the world stood on its head. And then what happened is, anytime I would hear any of these folks, I would read something that they had said, I immediately knew it was the same thing. So I could read Ramana Maharshi, I could read Nisargadatta, I could read whoever it was. They would have a comment, and I go, oh, I get where this comes from. Because now it was coming from the bottom out, and it all roosted or nested in exactly the same place. And all there was that each of those body minds had a different kind of expression. So we used to laugh about that, because Ramana Maharshi, very well-known saint in India, was kind of the perfect saint. Well, there was this next guy that came along, Nisargadatta, who wrote I Am That. And he was a beady maker. He made these foul little cigarettes in India, and he lived in the red light district. He had his place there, and they manufactured those, and he had Satsang up on top. Of course, he smoked these things incessantly, as did everybody in the building. So you can imagine the famous dignitaries from Europe and England and the US would come in to listen to this master, and they sat on the 4th floor in the red light district of Mumbai in stifling heat while everybody smoked beedies. That must have been a really kind of a moment for those folks. But he had a very short temper. Nisargadatta was known for having just a short temper. So his style was anything but the style of Ramana Maharshi. If you were to go out and look for a saint, you would have never stopped at Nisargadatta and said, I want that hot-headed little dude to be my guy. But, it turned out that's what it was. So his personality got lived in a certain way. So you can read when he says things in his quotes, he's got a short fuse. So there's not a whole lot of, it's like, wake up, you dumb nut, and here's what it is. As opposed to Ramana, who's this beautiful, flowing, this is how it lives and this is how it is. So those expressions are exactly the same expression. They come from exactly the same place. And that's how that piece operates. So the movement from the inside out. In a minute, we'll do a little something. I'm gonna work with this this question here. So I've heard you say story identity before. What's the difference between, what is the story identity, and what is the difference between story identity and true identity? So story identity is the identity that you construct. So when you and I look out there, we see everything that's there, and we're taught to cognize. And what cognition is extracting the pieces that you need to construct a story. So you look out there and you say, the dog went to the tree, so I need to have the dog and the tree and whatever the going on happens on, maybe it's grass or whatever. And I now have for you the constructed story of the dog goes to the tree. Now, I'm not telling you that there's an orange house over here and a cow over here and all of the stars in the sky and the moon and the rest of it. That story's been extracted. So it's an act of separation, to cognize, to pull it out. And then we traffic in those constructed stories, right? So guess what the most important story is? You're right, it's the story of you. Because we've learned how to cognize and we've been taught by everybody else that that is how cognition happens, then we construct a story of who we are, and that becomes our story identity, and we live as though that were true. Okay, so I was born in 1953. I was born in California. I was raised in the 60s in Southern California. Down on the south part, that's where the taco eaters all live. And so, that was my life story. And if you ask me who the Alan story is, what's the story identity? I'm going to express it in all those kind of terms. There's probably not a lot of folks more California. I'm fifth generation Californian. I'm as California as they come, straight, and as 60s as they come. So all of those things collided in this particular story identity. Okay, that's great. But is that the true identity? Right? So what happens is that story identity, because consciousness is really what's living that identity, right? And they both live in the same container. But because we've learned that what we are is just the upper piece, we eliminate the consciousness piece from the ongoing story. So our story identity doesn't include anything about consciousness, which is who we really are. That is our true identity. What we truly are is consciousness. Now, you say that sometimes, everybody goes, wait a minute, though, what about, how does the story identity then live if you actually locate in that true identity? Well, the reality is the true identity lives the story identity anyway. So you never have to worry about the story identity going away. Not possible, right? Anybody who meets me isn't going to say, oh, hey, look, he used to seem like a 60s dude from California, and now he seems like he's an Indian from 1842. Not going to happen, right? My language isn't going to change. My fidgetiness and my all of the stuff that's in here, I even have a little of the Nisargadatta short temper piece that Ramesh used to make fun of. So he used to say he was sandwiched. He was the only calm one amongst all of these hotheads. So I'm assuming he was thinking I was a hothead. But anyway, the true identity lives below that. So the path that you're on is one to recognize and actually be that true identity, right? Now, remember last time I told the story of the master bike teacher and how everybody figured out he was coming to town, so they went to watch what he did, and what they saw was this old man chasing a boy yelling, lean to the left, lean to the left, lean to the left. And so they the next day in the press, the secret of master bike riding, lean to the left. What they didn't recognize is that the boy leaned to the right. And so what he was doing is trying to get him into balance. How do you get him into balance? Well, you don't tell him to lean to the right, and you don't tell him cherish that right-handedness because, baby, you got to have that too. He just had him lean to the left because eventually he'd come into balance. So when you hear people talk, you hear me talk, I'm always talking about consciousness. And it seems like that's all there is, right? And the reality is the pointers are to move you to that place, because what's lacking in the perfectly balanced life is the actual recognition and awareness of consciousness itself. That part has been blocked out. So anybody who's trying to point to something, and trust me, I can't tell you how many times somebody will come and say to me, but Alan, you know what? We need to honor that stuff. We need to be that stuff. You can't sit around and not talk about that. You got to include it. And I just say, I know it looks like that. And I get what you're saying, but it wouldn't be in service of bringing someone into perfect awakening. Perfect awakening is the standing and recognition of consciousness that you are, and the rest of it takes care of itself. Your story identity will always live. It has no choice. You don't need to take care of that. There's no reason to. It does that by itself. So that's what that part is. Okay. So I've been talking about tangibility, and I've talked a lot of words today. So let me just, for a minute, I want you guys just to walk through with me. I'm going to do one little exercise, and maybe this will give everybody a little bit of a breathing moment. Now I'm not going to close my eyes because I could, but I'm not going to. But I'm inviting all of you to close your eyes, okay? And I'm going to go slow, which is hard to do. So from that position, I want to imagine that you're looking out at the world. Keep your eyes closed. You're not actually looking at the world, but you're replicating that inside. So you're now looking out at the world. Isn't that pretty cool? Okay. Now what I want you to do is I want you to see yourself in that world. So in other words, from the point of view of looking out on the world, can you include yourself? You can do that with your eyes open too, but don't do it this time. Do it with your eyes closed and include yourself. In other words, there is Alan. I can see Alan I can see the world, and from my perception, I can also see and experience Alan. There he is. I can experience his hands. I can experience his head. I can experience his legs. I can experience who he is. You got it? So now you're experiencing yourself in the world. You see that? Okay, now stay there. The world's out there and you're there in the world. All right? That's the natural perception. So now the question is, who's doing the watching? That's who you are. That's the piece of consciousness that you usually ignore, because when you usually look at the world, you take yourself out of the world and look from you, and the rest of the world is separate from you. But the reality is you're in the world. You and all of the world are one thing, and the watching is the consciousness that you are. Do you get a tangible sense of that? Now that's a kind of meditation. It's not guided, but it's something you can do anytime. You can shut your eyes, and actually you can then move to open eyes and go, oh yeah, I'm sitting here with open eyes. I see the world. I experience Alan. Alan's right here in the middle of it. I can do that, right? No problem. Who's doing the watching? And that is what most people call the I am. That is consciousness itself, which is looking through your eyes at the world. It's right there. That's who you are. You know, a lot of times I will say the only thing that we know is that we exist and the rest is interpretation. Well, that is the sense of existence, is that watching the rest of the world. You know you exist. That's the only thing that's known. The rest of it is constructed through cognition. I explained that earlier. It's a kind of meditation. So remember, a meditation is simply a device that once lived and lived enough becomes a permanent feature of life itself. So when somebody says, I meditate every day, I always say, well, I'm hoping that it sheds off at some point in time in your life as a meditation, right? Because what that tells me is that the experience of the watching, consciousness itself as awareness watching, is now included in all that is, and the ego hasn't excluded that part of the experience by usurping consciousness and pretending that you are that body and you're separate from everything and the rest of the world is out there. I find that one to be, that's probably my favorite one. That's the one that I think over time was incredible because it's tangible. You can feel it. I call it a felt experience for lack of a better word, but it is existence itself. And when I say existence, you exist. Now, there's no you. The knowing is simply known, and the existence is simply felt, right? So, I mean, you could tease this out, make it really kind of esoteric, but it's so basic. It's just the sense of existence and watching that you can sit in, and you can see you and everything else as the world arising. Your body, mind, and even your story exist in that manifestation. The watching and the consciousness sits behind all of that. Then the next thing is, early when I started, I talked about where is the permanent platform or permanent peace? There you go, right there. It's that sense of watching. It's that consciousness itself. I said you could sit and you could think of your whole life as it rolled through you. Well, recognize you are in the world. The rolling through that I'm talking about is the consciousness that you are and how you and everything else rolled through it, right? Often people will say, I don't feel any different today than I did when I was 5 years old. Because here and now, consciousness is always exact. It's the stable platform of all that is, and it's always the same. Anything that's different requires separation. So when anybody says, are you at a higher or a lower level of consciousness? I know they're not talking about consciousness. They're talking about manifestation. There can't be a higher or lower level of consciousness. All there is that existence and watching. All the rest of it's mental. It's been divided, separated, and mapped. So those are really great ways to actually live and experience consciousness itself. So when we talk about all of this, and you can ask questions or raise your hand, because I'm happy to go into that tangible part. Even story itself has a tangibility. So whenever we can point to or make it tangible, we want to do that. Most of the time we do that by breaking down how the mind holds it, because the essence of who we think we are follows that. We behave as if that were true. We've got to get past that as if to get to that tangibility. But anything we can do that, anytime we come up with, we can crack that code, we want to do that. So that people think that this just isn't a place where people come and all that happens is listening. I received a thing. I'm one of those people, I don't know why, but people send me volumes of spiritual points of view. I don't know whether it's to convince me that what I'm saying is full of crap, or whether they're trying to add to my repertoire. But seemingly I need to receive all of this. But I got one this last week about how people who seek enlightenment ignore what's going on in the world, and because of that, ignore what really needs to be done. It was one of those kinds of things, right? And that is just an exercise in separation. It's claiming that spirituality is somehow separate from all of the things that take place. If you are lived authentically, you will always do exactly the thing that needs to be done. No, never need to worry about that part. It will be exactly as it should be. And even though you might see things now as not how they should be because of this radio interference of the ego covering up that's happening perfectly anyway, you'll look back and go, oh, I see, that was true. You didn't experience it that way, but it was true. Cool. All right, guys, I've gone on for 1:10 tonight. I had a nice run. I am, if no one is here to put the brakes on, I hope you enjoyed that little piece at the end. And I'll be back here in a couple of weeks. This is really enjoyable for me. It's probably, of the work I do, the thing I enjoy the most. If you know anybody that wants to come in and they want to listen, they want to ask questions, please let them know. It's open for everyone. And it's a joy to sit and talk to you all. I didn't have anybody volunteer to come up and talk to me, but maybe we'll get some of that to happen. Well, I got Justine to come up with her fogged camera, but that was it. So until next time, thank you, Carolyn. Same to you. I will talk to you all in a couple of weeks, and I'm glad you like the exercise, James. That's one of my favorites too. Thanks, Greg. All right, guys. Until next time, take care and much love. Bye.